So if you're going to say you believe in an all-good, all-powerful God, but we live in a universe where evil exists, I see that as a clear contradiction. If you're going to convince me of that position, you're going to have to prove that your own moral views are internally consistent. If God is perfect, the idea that he would make the world worse, if he's the only thing in it and him being perfect, he's adding imperfection. So why would a perfect being create something or make things worse, objectively speaking?
Hello, bro. How are you?
Oh, hello. Yeah, I tried going on your stream before. I wanted to debate you on the problem of evil.
Do you want to talk to somebody who's like more of an expert on the problem of evil than I am?
Who?
Than, if you're interested, you want to come up and do this? This is more your field than mine.
Yeah, if you think somebody could debate the topic better, that's totally fine.
We'll go ahead, and then if he comes up, he can continue off that.
Okay. Well, for those of you who aren't familiar with the problem of evil, it was an argument made by Epicurus that essentially postulates that in a universe where there's an all-powerful, all-good God, that all-powerful, all-good God would have both the power and motivation to prevent evil from existing. So if we assume evil does indeed exist in this universe, which I think we could probably both agree on, that would make the existence of an all-powerful, all-good God in this universe impossible due to the existence of evil.
Well, right off the bat, I think there's like an issue with that. And this isn't like a defeat or the argument. It's just I think if there is no God, then there is no evil. So it's kind of like a contradiction. So if you say that the evidence of evil disproves God, so it's like we have evil, then there is no God.
Well, it
And if the God
disproves.
doesn't exist, then there is no evil. And so it's kind of like this
Well,
circular
a
thing.
God could exist. The point being made is that an all-good, all-powerful God would not be able to exist. So you could have a god like
I,
Zeus, you could have a god like Crom from Conan, gods that aren't all good and may not
well, no,
also
no, I
be
don't
all
think you
powerful.
understood. I don't think you understood what I was saying. I think it'd be better if you said more along the lines of the problem of evil or the problem of suffering rather than the problem of evil, because the problem of suffering can exist in atheistic worldview, but the problem of evil couldn't. I don't think. Anyways, this is Than.
Hi.
Hey, Than, what's going on?
What's up, bro? So is that like, are you just running a logical problem of evil here, or are
It's
you
more
saying like,
the
are you saying it's logically impossible, or are you saying like there's probabilistic tension?
well, it's really the you could say it's a logical problem of evil, but I usually rely more on the practical problem, because if we can agree that evil doesn't in fact exist in this universe that we're living in, then there's clearly a practical problem here, where if there is an all-good, all-powerful God, he would not allow evil to exist in the universe we're living in.
Okay, so you think there is a logical problem, as in, and by evil, right? I'm assuming. Are you a moral, like, do you believe moral facts exist, or is this just going to be like an internal critique kind of a thing where?
Well, it's an internal critique.
Yeah,
So I'm personally a moral anti-realist, but if you're
yeah,
going to
that's totally
convince
fine.
me, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm just asking so that way we're on the same page, and I'm not going to throw answers at you that's just pointless. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, because I totally agree that you can be a moral anti-realist and throw the logical problem of evil at somebody because it's an internal critique. I just want to understand what you're really trying to get at, because if you're saying that there is a logical impossibility, I'm gonna need some like more motivation here. That's it at the end of the day, because it seems like you're not going to really be able to get this argument off the ground without making some sort of value assumptions. You know what I'm
Nope, I
saying?
don't. So again, it's an internal critique. So
Mm-hmm.
whether you agree with, so I'm assuming you're a moral realist. Do you believe like there are real moral claims that are made by God? If you're going to convince me of that position, you're going to have to prove that your own moral views are internally consistent.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to say you believe in an all-good, all-powerful God, but we live in a universe where evil exists, I see that as a clear contradiction. So either your
Yeah.
God is not all good, not all
What's
powerful, or
yeah
does not exist at all.
yeah. I'm familiar with the argument. I'm just what's the contradiction? Like, where's the A and not A?
Well, the contradiction is you're claiming there is an all-powerful, all-good God. Assuming God is powerful enough to destroy evil and is all good, so has a motivation to not allow evil to exist, then in a universe that we live in where evil exists, that would prove like one of three possibilities. Either God does not exist at all, God does exist, but he's not all powerful, but he is all good, or he's all good, but not all powerful.
I think the problem
Yeah.
is you're presupposing that God would not allow for some sort of evil, that he has to have it either necessary
That
or
would be,
completely. Yeah.
yeah,
That's the
that would be
presupposition that you're making.
presupposed if he's all good.
Why? Like, what I'm not understanding is the motivation in the in this sentence that you're saying, which is God would lack any motivations to allow evil and suffering. Like, why should I believe that?
Why would you believe an all good God would allow evil?
Why would I believe an all good God would not allow evil and suffering or have any justified reasons for allowing suffering and evil?
Well, because he's all good. So if you're all
So,
good, all
well, that's a
loving,
circular
benevolent,
argument. An all good God
Mhm.
would not have motivations for allowing suffering, evil because he's all good.
that's not a circular argument. That like that's just analytical. That's
That's
a
not
clear
true.
analytical
Yeah.
assumption.
So
Like that would be
within
analytically linked.
yeah, so within metaethics, we have like this problem of like the myth of shared axiology, for instance. Axiology is just like the study of value theory. And in this discussion, there like we cannot have these discussions without discussions about value theory and assumptions about value theory. So what's going on is you might have a particular value theory in your head and conjoining that to theism and then making a prediction about what kind of world you'd expect to see if there was an all good God. But if it's truly an internal critique, you're going to have to adopt the value theory that the Christian's going to hold to, not the one that you hold to. Right?
So, in your value theory, you believe an all good God would allow for mass genocides of millions of people. He would allow for millions of children to be horribly abused in sexual
So
ways.
I'll just pause you. I'll just pause you real quick because I'm also live on TikTok. Just be careful of like
Sure.
certain words
Okay.
that you use if you
I'll
don't mind.
respect that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I didn't tell you anything about my value theory. I just told you that you're going to have to motivate your argument a little bit more than just saying good entails no suffering,
Well,
right? Because look, do you want me to call you vegan?
we're not talking
What
about
do you want me to
suffering
call you?
specifically. We're talking about evil. So,
Wait,
you,
what do you
I'm
want me to
just
call you? Do you
asking
want me to call you
you.
vegan or what?
You can call me Vegan Gains. Like my
Okay,
actual name's Richard. You can just call me that if whatever you
okay,
prefer.
cool.
But let me just ask you. So, in your own theological theory, you think an all good God would allow for millions of people to be genocided? So, like,
This isn't actually a theological question at this point, right?
you just
My value
said
theory stands independent of my theology, right?
So you just said if I'm going to have an internal critique, I have to have an understanding of your own values or what you believe God to be. So I'm just asking you a question so I can understand. Would
Yeah,
an
I'm just
all good
clarifying
God
because you
allow
said because
for millions of people to be genocided in a like horrible way, where there's gas chambers, people are starved to death, there's
yeah,
horrible,
I mean,
inhumane
look,
experiments
yeah,
conducted
I'm
against
hearing,
them?
dude. I'm hearing you. I'm just making a correction, right? Because you said in your theological theory, I'm just correcting you. I'm saying this isn't a
I'd like you
theological.
to just answer the question: would an all good
Yeah, of
God
course.
allow for this to happen?
Yeah, I think an all good God would allow for these things because I think all of these instances are not intrinsically instances that make it such that an agent would be cut off from having a life that is on the whole good in this life or the next life. Like, I think all of these instances of horrific suffering that we see in this world are the types of suffering that a perfect God can redeem and types of suffering that an agent, no matter how horrific, can look back on their life, including in the afterlife, and say, my life was still, even in spite of that, worth living.
Okay, you realize there are people who literally only live for like several days or several
That is
months, and they're
totally
in horrible
consistent
pain
with what I
because they're
just said.
built like they're made without skin.
That is totally consistent with what I just said.
Okay, so this idea of redemption I mean, in theory, you could have a situation where somebody suffers horribly during their life, and then God makes up for that by giving you like infinite
Nope,
paradise.
nope. This is not about compensation.
Well, you just said redemption.
Yeah, but redemption doesn't
That
equal
would
compensation. I'm just
the
clarifying.
context in which you said it insinuated compensation.
I didn't mean to make that insinuation, so this is my clarification. It's not about compensation. This is again about, if you look into the psychology of meaning making and trauma, for instance, we have this psychology of meaning making where, and you can look like we talk about, look at Viktor Frankl and all these other people, where people can look back on the most horrific aspects of their lives and still deem their lives worthy and worth living.
Well,
And
sure.
most of the
I'm
time, well, and if you let me finish, and a lot of these times, these people will look back on their lives and choose not to erase their memories or anything like that. They'll say, like, I wouldn't want to go through that again. But these are all also like, they tend to be memories that these people treasure because they've kind of cultivated themselves into this identity that they have now. And all I'm saying is, so long as an evil or any aspect of suffering is an event, that does not make it impossible for an agent to have a life that they consider on the whole worth living. I think God is justified in allowing that suffering.
Well, that's a completely different topic, whether or not people think their life is worth living despite going through evil or suffering. That could very well be the case, that everyone who's ever suffered or experienced evil or committed evil thinks their life is worth living. The issue is whether or not an all-powerful, benevolent being would allow for that evil or suffering to take
If
place.
my value theory is true, which I think it is, then then a God would allow for that type of suffering. There's no internal
Okay,
inconsistency here.
so does an all-good God have an interest in a universe that's better than a theoretical universe where there's infinite horrible suffering that never ends?
Infinite horrible suffering that never ends.
Yes.
Yeah, that's going to depend on your value theory.
Well, I'm asking you, would a benevolent God create a universe where there's infinite unending suffering?
I don't know if that I even have to answer that question yet, unless you're like ready to move on and say like the logical problem doesn't work here.
I'm not moving on. I'm trying to understand like you're making the case that an all-powerful benevolent God would allow for suffering.
Yep.
So I'm just trying to
I
see
know.
like how much
I just
suffering.
gave you one proposition within my value theory that shows that there's no logical contradiction. I didn't give you a
Well, you
theodicy.
didn't,
I didn't give you a
and we're
theodicy which
exploring
predicts
that.
what kind of world you'd see on the condition theism is true, right? I just showed you
Look,
there's no logical inconsistency. Now we can
you
talk about
didn't.
theodicy if you want to,
Well,
but I'm
you
not going
didn't,
to do
and
that
we're
until you're
exploring
ready
that
to move
topic
on
still.
from the logical problem, right?
You didn't prove that there's no contradiction, and we're still exploring that
Okay,
topic.
so
So,
I gave you I gave you my one aspect of my value
am I
theory.
able to answer questions and have you answer?
I have been answering them. I'm just
Well, no,
relaying
you
where we're
haven't.
at dialectically really quick, which is I gave you my value theory. So can you show me a contradiction between like that one proposition of my value theory and
We're exploring
theism?
that right now.
Okay, go ahead.
So that's why I'm asking you this question. So, would an all-powerful, benevolent being not want a universe that has infinite, unending suffering?
No, not on my theodicy, no.
So God has no interest in creating a universe where there is not infinite, unending suffering.
No, by given my value theory that I gave you, the defeat condition, that would
Okay,
be in
okay,
direct contradiction, right, with never-ending suffering because people would never have redemption, right?
okay. So an all-powerful, benevolent being is totally fine with unending suffering. So if that's the
No, no,
case,
Is that
if
you
that's
no, I
misunderstood
just
what
said
you
no.
misunderstood what he said. So
sorry,
wait,
so
so
God does have a problem with it.
no. So his worldview is that eventually all suffering is defeated. So if you introduce a world where there's never ending suffering, that contradicts his worldview. So he rejects that.
Okay, so a benevolent God would have an interest in not allowing infinite, unending suffering.
Mhm.
Okay. So would a benevolent God have an interest in in creating a world that is better than a world where, say, people suffer for 100 years? Would you want to minimize that to 99 years?
Oh
So
yeah,
everyone
then we're just
born,
gonna run it. Yeah, what's gonna happen there is we're shifting from a logical problem to probabilistic issues now, just so you know. And you're gonna run into
well,
this
it's not a
arbitrariness.
probabilistic issue. I'm just asking you,
Yeah,
does a
trust
benevolent
me,
God
we're gonna
have an
shift there.
interest in
I've done this
lowering
long enough
suffering?
to know that we're gonna shift there. But nonetheless, we're gonna run into an arbitrariness problem at that point. Not
It's
get rid
not
of the years.
arbitrary.
It's a second. Would God want 1 second or less second? And this is where in my natural theology, I'm going to say God doesn't really create any specific kind of world. I think God creates initial world segments. So the modal landscape is open. And at that point, then God creates the best kinds of worlds. And the range of suffering that's allowed to happen is going to happen within a particular range. So this defeat condition that I gave you kind of sets the boundary parameters of the type of suffering, the propensity of suffering, all that kind of stuff that you're going to see. From there, I can give you a theodicy, which would tell you what kind of suffering in the structure and the fabric of reality that you expect to see if God exists. But asking this whole 99 years versus 100 years question, again, I don't have an answer to that. I don't have to give you an answer because with my modal strategy that I have with the way I've built got like my natural theology, it's an acceptable range, right? Not a unique prediction of how many years or anything like that we're going to run into.
I'm not asking you to predict how much suffering God would be okay with. I'm just asking you whether or not a benevolent being would have an interest in reducing everybody's suffering from 100 years to 99 years, or 98 years, or 50 years, or 1 year.
I would
Would
just
he be interested in reducing suffering?
I would just say that's an overly simplistic question because it depends on the context, right? Like, what are the other
I don't think it does.
supervening? Because I think what God is going to do and what we think a good God would do is not going to be strictly meta-normative. I mean, meta-ethical in its constraints. I think the way we make theistic prediction is going to happen on a meta-normative account, meaning God's going to make decisions based off of all domains of value, which is like the alethic domains, the aesthetic domains, and the moral domains, or like the true, the good, and the beautiful. And so, whether or not God is going to choose 99 years over 100 years, I can't really answer that because I don't know the full context of everything. I would just say the answer there is going to be
Okay,
inscrutable.
okay. So would God say not want the Holocaust to happen? Would he not want children to be abused?
Would he not want child? What do you? Can you like? You're just asking?
Would the
There's
benevolent
also
God that you believe in, would he had preferred the Holocaust not happen?
But
Yeah.
there's also something to kind of, I think you got to clarify too, is because there's a difference between allowing something to happen and having a preference for it to not happen.
There's a difference between permitting something and not desiring something.
Well, sure. And if you were all powerful and benevolent, you would not permit certainly
No,
horrible
you're
actions.
smuggling in your value theory again.
Okay,
I
if
think God is
you,
going to permit things that are intrinsically defeasible, right?
what does that mean?
The whole an event that is such that does not make it the case that an agent can't look back on their whole life in this life or the next life and still think their life is worth living.
That's a separate issue to whether or not a benevolent God would have an interest in stopping evil.
You made a very specific claim. You said that they would not allow that thing in these types of events. And I'm saying if this defeat condition is true, which is internal to my worldview, then it's within the boundary conditions of the types of things that are compatible with God's existence.
So, like again, you just talked about how if somebody went through some horrible tragedy like the Holocaust, they could look back on their life and still think their life was worth living.
Hmm.
That is entirely separate from the subject of whether or not a benevolent being would allow that to happen.
No, it's not.
It is. Those are two completely different topics.
Explain to me how they're different topics.
Yeah, so one is one's personal perspective on whether or not they would still want to live despite living through a situation like that, versus whether or not a benevolent being would have an interest in stopping that to begin with,
And you don't see
that
the
evil
connection
action.
between that subjective mental state that I'm talking
There's
about,
no
and whether or not
connection.
God is going to allow that suffering, and whether or not he'd be justified in allowing that suffering?
No, there's no connection there. They're
Yeah,
completely
okay. Let me make
separate.
the connection really explicit, because I'm assuming you're operating on a value assumption that the only type of suffering God would allow is suffering that is necessary for some greater good or something like that. I don't know. And I'm denying that, and I'm saying, no, God is justified in allowing suffering that is defeasible, or events that creatures can still look back on and retroactively endorse.
Okay, so a benevolent being, this God that you believe in, that you assume to be benevolent, he doesn't even have an interest in allowing evil to allow for a greater good to occur. It's just based on the
Nope, I
assumption
never
that
said that. I did not give you a theodicy. Yeah.
you didn't you literally just say these evils can occur
Yeah,
without the
that's
greater
not a
good being
theodicy,
created?
though. A theodicy is gonna tell you what kind of world you're gonna predict or expect to see if God exists. I gave you one proposition, which is a mediating proposition in how we assess our hypotheses, but that's not gonna predict the world that we're gonna see, right? Like, the defeat condition could be true, and we could just be in a pure heaven type world. Yeah? Like, with no suffering or pain?
Sure, and I'm very confused why a god wouldn't just create that sort of world if he's benevolent and all powerful.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's going outside of the logical problem of evil. Graham Oppy has written on that question you're asking. He's an atheist philosopher, and it's called The Problem of Heaven, but that's a different question than the logical problem of evil.
That is
John, I'm not trying to
directly
hijack
tied.
your stream, by the way, so just
No,
Oh,
whatever.
I'm loving this. So you go
Okay.
ahead.
yeah, I think that's clearly the issue, because if we're assuming, like,
So,
evil wouldn't
are you
exist
conceding
in
that?
heaven,
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
if we're assuming, like, evil would not exist in heaven, and God is benevolent, why would he allow evil to exist when he could have, like, some perfect divine realm where everyone lives in
Yeah,
peace and harmony
that's a
without
great
evil?
question, and I'm willing to talk about that. But you came in here to talk about the logical problem of evil. If you're happy to put that aside or
That
say
that's
there's no
directly
contradiction,
related.
if you're saying there's no contradiction, we can move
There's
on.
clearly a contradiction since evil exists.
But
Also, just like a side note on that, I don't know what Than's going to say to this, but me personally, I do hold that there is the possibility of evil in heaven. That's my personal viewpoint. So,
Okay.
but you go ahead, Than.
no, see, these are two different questions, though, vegan. The problem of heaven is, why didn't God create heaven in the first place instead of creating a world like this? But it's not really pointing to a contradiction. The problem of
That
evil,
is
as you've put it, is trying to tie an inherent logical inconsistency between the proposition that God exists and the proposition that evil exists.
no, it's the proposition that an all good, all powerful God exists
Yeah,
and the
when I
existence
say
of
the word
evil.
God,
So,
contained within that word is those triomny attributes.
well, so first of all, you can have a God that's not all good
I
or not all
understand that, but
powerful.
obviously within the context we're in, it should be assumed that that's what I'm talking about, is perfect being theism.
I I think, just to make things as clear as possible, you should mention those attributes because people are going to
I
get
don't have to
very
do this when I'm
confused.
talking to professional philosophers. I don't know why I have to do that with you, but that's
Okay, well, I just prefer that because it can make the discussion confusing, especially for, like, some viewers. But regardless, if that's what you mean whenever you invoke God, but again, if we're assuming God to be all powerful and all benevolent, like, if you're going to say that an all powerful benevolent deity would allow for mass genocides where millions and millions of people are killed, lives are destroyed, people are tortured in the most horrific ways. Like, to this day, I don't know how many child abusers there are, but it's probably
yeah,
in the
it's
millions.
horrible. I know.
And you're telling me that a benevolent deity who has the power to stop it would have no interest in intervening, at least not directly.
I never said that.
It sounds to me
I'm
like you're talking about a
well,
completely
hold on.
different
No, no, no.
conceptualization of being all good.
You're jumping the gun now from divine justification and divine prediction to divine psychology. I never made claims about what God would be motivated to do or not motivated to do, because again, I haven't given you any theodicy. All I've done so far is talk about one axiological proposition that mediates between the proposition God exists and the proposition that evil and suffering exists, and showed that this mediating proposition is does not generate a contradiction between those two other ones.
Okay, would a
Does that make
benevolent
sense what I
deity?
just said to you? Like, can you echo
No,
that
not
back to me?
particularly. No, not particularly.
Can you like make just for the sake, just because it seems like the two of you are talking past each other, can you make the attempt to try to steelman his argument?
Well, no, look, let me just rephrase this. That's all. So all I'm saying is, because for you, or what you're saying is there's this proposition, you have this triumny God, and another proposition, evil and suffering exists. You're saying that because of what a triumny God is, all good, all loving, all powerful, that it would be logically impossible for evil to exist. And I'm saying that is only going to be true if you assume a value theory that makes it the case that a triumny God would not be justified or have any reasons for allowing that suffering. Like, those are the two things you got to defend. If I can show you that God can be justified in allowing the suffering independent of any divine reasons for allowing that suffering, I don't have a contradiction on my hands. And this is why philosophers
That
have
would
and
be
this is why
that.
philosophers have
Okay,
moved
that would be
on from the
your.
logical problem of evil since the 80s and have instead opted for probabilistic versions like William Rose Fawn, for instance, or in there's so many others, but you get the point.
Yeah, so that would be up to you to actually point that out, because that would be assumed an all good, all powerful deity would stop horrible acts of evil
Why
like
would it be
abuse
assumed?
of children,
Why would it be assumed?
because he's all good.
So
If you are
so
all good, you would not
But
allow evil
that's the
to
whole point.
exist.
That's the whole point, Richard.
it seems like, Richard, that what you're doing is it's just like an intuition pump. It seems intuitively true that something should step in and do it. What Than is making the argument against is that there is no logical contradiction in a being not stepping in
Well,
and
there clearly
preventing it.
is, and he hasn't proven that there
No, I
isn't.
have, because again,
If he's going to claim there's a justification for an all good being to allow for evil, then make the argument.
Can you? Okay, so because I just feel like you guys have gone in
We're-
circles. So that's the only reason I'm jumping in.
yeah. Can I just say
So
one thing
Sure,
really
yeah, I
quickly?
appreciate that.
I just want
Yeah.
Vegan, if you don't mind, can you give the contradictions in premises and a conclusion?
Yeah, okay, so premise one, if God is all good and all powerful, he would have the ability to, and motivation, to not allow evil to exist. Premise two, evil does exist. Premise three, therefore, God would not have, well, that would be the conclusion.
Okay.
God is either not able to stop evil, or he is not all good, or a combination of the two.
Okay, and then I'm assuming you're disagreeing with premise one.
No, well, did we
That
restate
would have to be a
restate
disagreement
premise
with
one
premise
again?
one.
Yeah.
Yeah, premise one is if God is all powerful and all good, he would have both the motivation and power to stop all evil. So you would have to be disagreeing with premise one, because premise two is evil exists, and I think you agree with that.
Yeah, no. Well, it depends on how you cash out premise one in like with the nuance, because I can technically agree with it and just say that the argument doesn't actually follow, depending on what you mean by premise one.
How does it
But you
not
can also,
follow?
because again, given my axiology, God can have the motivation and the power to stop all evil and suffering, and he does eventually. But if but if what you mean by those words in premise one is that you mean like all suffering and evil immediately in like a chronological sequence, then I would deny it.
Yeah, I like, again, if he's all good, all powerful, he'd be able to stop all evil immediately. So
Yeah,
if
but
he
you
is
also
all
included this
good,
motivation question in there, yeah?
So I think your premise one should be like rephrased to he would have never allowed it in the first place rather
sure,
than
we
stopping it.
can we can do that.
Okay.
Well, it's an important nuance, right?
Yeah, sure, I understand. So premise one would be,
Yeah.
if God, if God is all powerful and benevolent, he would never allow for evil to exist. Premise two, evil exists, therefore God is either not all powerful or not all good, or a combination of the two.
Yeah, and like I'm saying, I think just given the defeat condition that I've lined out, right? There is no contradiction. You have to assume a different value theory than I do in this argument to make it work. But the moment you do that, it's no longer a logical problem because you have to adopt my whole worldview when you do a logical problem like that.
Well, look, if you're going to claim an all-powerful benevolent being would allow for thousands and thousands of years of human existence, you're talking about a time period of 200,000. That's also not taking into account,
Animal
the
suffering,
millions of years that
evolution.
animals.
Yep, I agree.
So
Yeah, that's
so this is more now the evidential problem rather than the logical
yeah.
problem. Yeah.
So if you're going to tell me that a benevolent being would allow animals to murder, kill, sexually abuse each other over a period of millions of years, allowed for hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution where we're committing tribal genocides, horrible atrocities,
Hmm.
allowing for strange cults and religions that allowed for child sacrifices, really disgusting sex rituals, so on and so forth, and going into the modern world where we have the technology to perpetrate horrific holocausts of human beings where millions and millions of people are killed. We have the internet now where there are networks of child abusers where millions of them interact and share their abuse with children. And you're telling me a benevolent being would not be motivated enough to, like, at least to some substantial extent, stop at least some of these horrific atrocities. Like, I can understand him maybe allowing some people who had a disagreement to trade fisticuffs and rosy some cheeks. But when you're talking about horrible atrocities that have occurred over millions and millions of years, where there's horrible, horrific suffering conducted, it sounds to me like if you're claiming there's no contradiction here between that and an all-powerful benevolent being, it sounds to me like you have a completely different conceptualization of what evil is and what benevolence is.
No,
Can
I,
I
I
can I
like I
ask
said.
a quick
Oh, go ahead,
question
go ahead,
then? Is
yeah.
that okay? Yeah,
For
if you
sure,
have something
bro.
important enough. There's like a point that you made, like I can understand a God allowing like rosying some cheeks. Is not the problem of suffering or even the problem of
We're
evil,
talking about evil specifically.
right? But
So you could have like they're suffering on different degrees, right?
sure.
Like
So
when I work
that's
out, I'm kind of suffering a little bit. Like you can get a really bad burn in your quads. That's not
Yeah, we're talking
evil.
about
That's something
horrific
completely
right.
different.
Well, hold on. Let me ask my question. So you said you could allow for like some rosying of cheeks. Isn't the problem of suffering or the problem of evil in general subjective? Isn't that going to vary on the individual person's subjective experience of
That's
Well,
where I was gonna go with that, John.
I'm a
Oh,
moral
sorry.
anti-realist.
Sorry, Than, I stole your
Um,
No,
thunder.
no, you're good, bro.
yeah, so I'm a moral anti-realist. So yeah, I do think this is all ultimately subjective. But if you're gonna try to convince me of some
Oh no,
worldview where there's like an objective moral basis that God creates, and
I
you're
actually
claiming that this God is benevolent, like I mean, like you could technically. I don't know if you're a moral anti-realist as well, and if God's a moral anti-realist. But
me.
Go ahead,
then that
Than.
would kind of defeat the idea of there being a benevolent God. It would just be an all-powerful God.
Yeah, so I know I'm a moral realist. I don't ground morality in God. My metaphysics are a little wonky compared to typical Christians, but that's fine. Um, yeah, let me point something. Let me talk about something here because John poked at something that I really wanted to get to, which is the subjective aspect that you're poking at is the whole entire point of what I'm talking about. Because I think the most important thing when you're talking about the problem of evil is not what happens to an agent, but what that agent becomes and how they can integrate whatever event happens to them into their life and whether or not they can retroactively endorse the life they've lived or not. That's what I think is the most important. And so the subjective aspect of this is the whole entire point. Like you can call these events objectively evil and I will stand right alongside you. They are horrific. But if an agent can look back on their life in this life or the next, it falls within the boundary conditions. Sorry, I didn't even finish my sentence there. If an agent can look back on those types of events in their life, in this life or the next, and still endorse the life they've lived, those events fall within the boundary conditions of the types of things that God would allow. So that's psychology of
Clearly he's
meaning making.
allowing it. So clearly he's allowing it. The issue is, why would he be allowing it?
Well, that's a
It
different
doesn't
question.
seem like it's
That's
out of benevolence.
that's a different question than whether or not there's a logical contradiction.
Well, yeah, that's a completely separate topic. We can agree he's allowing it, clearly. We live in this world.
Okay,
Um,
so
the issue is, why would a benevolent being allow this?
So
And just
now
because you can...
you're
So
asking
wait,
for the mechanism, correct?
I'm almost done, but I mean, if lost my train of thought. If he's allowing this and assuming he's benevolent, it would stand to reason that if this God is benevolent and all powerful, he could presumably create a better world. Like, would the world be better if there wasn't a Holocaust?
what
Would
does
the
the
world
word
be better if there
better?
wasn't a
What
war
does
in
the word
Ukraine? Would the
better
world be better
mean?
if there weren't, people who prey upon
Yeah,
children?
what does the word better
I
mean?
think we could agree.
What does the word better mean?
Yeah, so superior versus another state.
That
So
I'm not. Yeah, I'm asking you what like the theoretical contents, right? Because when you're saying the word better, I'm assuming you're making a value judgment there. But I'm asking you, what do you mean by that? Because
well,
if it's
this
something
is
that I don't hold to value theory wise, then it doesn't really matter what
okay.
you say
Sure.
would be better.
So do you think somebody who abuses children as opposed to not abusing children, would you say the state of not abusing children is better than abusing children?
Yeah. But I also don't judge.
Right. So
I also
then
don't judge
that
realities by unique tokens of suffering. I judge reality on the whole about what the kind of
sure.
world we
And
live in, right?
as a whole, if we could eradicate child predators in some way, either by changing people's minds so they're not attracted to children, locking them up in some different dimension, or not allowing them to exist in the first place, would that world be better than a world that has millions of child abusers?
Oh yeah, and we're gonna eventually get that world.
Okay, and if God is all powerful and benevolent, then why would he allow that to exist if you
You're
agree that
asking me a
theoretical
question.
world would
You're
be
asking me a
better?
question again that I'm not gonna move forward to answering until you concede there's no logical problem.
There's clearly a logical problem.
No,
If your God
you're poking at
would
a
your God agree
probabilistic
with you?
problem.
Would
What?
your God agree with you that a world that does not have child abusers is better than a world that
I mean,
does
look,
have
man, we
child
can play this
abusers, all
rhetorical
else
sleight of
held
hand
equal?
game all you want, but at the end of the day, I want to know whether or not
It's a
there's a
simple
contradiction or
question.
not. Okay,
It's a
what is the
simple
contradiction? Because the why question is not the same question as a logical consistency question. If I ca theoretically, if I don't have an answer for why, that
a
still doesn't get you to a contradiction. You're conflating theistic prediction and disconfirmation with theistic contradiction. In other words, you're conflating the idea that there's a logical impossibility with something rather than a probabilistic tension, right?
Yeah, so
When you ask a why
I can
question,
very easily outline the contradiction. So premise one, if God is all powerful and benevolent, then and he would see a world in which there are no predators being superior to a world where there
yeah,
are predators.
I'm gonna deny that premise right now again because I don't
So your
agree with
God
your value
disagrees
theory.
with you. He thinks this world that has child predators is superior to a world that would not have child predators, all else held equal.
Yeah, because we live in a world.
So a
Hold on, let me
world
finish.
with child predators is better than a world without child predators, all else held equal. You'd rather child predators exist.
I think a world where redemption, bravery, courage, sacrifice, honor, and all these types of things where a narrative arc exists, where people can freely choose their actions, is a much better world than a world with autonomous robots or moral robots. I'm gonna say that.
So is God a moral robot?
What does that question have to do with what I just said? Because it sounds like you're trying to reframe the conversation right now because you realize you can't
No,
actually
no.
force a contradiction right now.
So no. First of all, if you're going to claim that God is all powerful and benevolent, and he would presumably agree that a world with child predators includes evil, and a world without child predators, all else hold equal, contains less evil, and he is not interested in taking away the child predators.
Ugh, can you
That
just
seems
tell
to
me the
me like a
contradiction,
God who
man?
is
Can
not
you just give me the
benevolent.
contradiction?
Yeah, okay, so I'll outline it. Premise one, God, if God is all powerful and benevolent, and there is presumably a world in which child predators do not exist, all else held equal, would be superior to a world where child predators do exist.
That's
What
not
is
a
Child,
that's
P
not
and
a
not
so
P?
so
You're
so
giving
hold
me a
on.
deductive argument. Just give me
Yeah,
the P and not P.
so that's not a contradiction. That's a presupposition of what you would expect to see under certain circumstances.
Like you cannot you have two propositions, but those two propositions by themselves do nothing. You have to insert a value theory. You have to make some sort of value judgment assumptions, right? And that's fine. Like if you want to assume some sort of hedonistic worldview where pleasure is the ultimate good and pain should be like avoided at all costs, fine. The conjunction of hedonism, theism, and suffering, there's a contradiction,
So
right?
okay, I think I'm
what
seeing I think I'm seeing a bit of an issue here, and I think I can outline it. So you're telling me that if we weren't, say, free acting moral agents where we could commit evil, that wouldn't allow for things like bravery, honor, because everyone would just be, I don't know, acting perfect, and we might not be able to conceptualize, courageous acts, heroism, honor. So, by that definition, would a world that has child predators, like would that be a good thing then?
No,
Like, people
that's a
committing
conflation
evil
again.
would therefore be a good because it allows for
No,
a
so
greater
yeah,
degree of good to happen?
you're making a ontological mistake here because again, there's a difference between intrinsic value and instrumental value, right? Intrinsic value is going to be the value of the thing itself. Instrumental value is not going to be a judgment of a thing's value in of itself, but rather it's it's like placed in a narrative structure um, of a particular context, right? So like pain, I would say could be theoretically intrinsically disvaluable, but it could be instrumentally valuable in the sense that it helps people grow, encourage, and toughness, and blah 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 blah. But you can't conflate the two.
Okay. Um, trying to progress the discussion on from here.
I think, and just to clarify, so from my understanding, and you seem to be holding pretty hard to that there is some logical contradiction. I haven't seen one, but where you keep trying to push the conversation is into the evidential. I think to move the conversation forward, it probably is best to bite the bullet and say, I don't see a logical contradiction. Let's go into the probable explanation, say it's less likely that we would expect an all-loving God given the circumstances of the world that we have, which seems to be the argument that you're pushing forward.
Well, I suppose we could do that, but I think we haven't resolved this exactly with the logical contradiction, because you seem to consider that there isn't a logical contradiction between the existence of evil and the existence of an all good,
No, I don't think there is.
benevolent God. So, is God perfect?
Yep.
Would a perfect being create something that's imperfect?
Can you stop asking me
Like,
questions and just give me P and not P?
okay,
Well,
sure.
I
Perfect.
think you agreed to bite the bullet, move to the evidential, right?
Oh, sure. Okay.
Yeah.
We can do that, but if we're going to agree that a perfect, like, would a perfect being create a, like, do something that would make the world worse?
What do you mean by worse?
Okay, so it was the universe perfect with God only in it?
No, I think only God's perfect. Because
Right. So if there's
presumably
only,
where you're going, look, presumably where you're going from this is why would a perfect God, create an imperfect world or even create at all, right? That's in the philosophical literature. You have the problems of general creation and the problem of particular creation. That's the question it's poking at. Yeah, I'm assuming that's where you're going.
yeah. So if God is perfect, the idea that he would make the world worse, if he's the only thing in it and him being perfect, he's adding imperfection. So why would a perfect being create something, or make things worse, objectively speaking?
Are you trying to point to a logical inconsistency here or an
Yeah,
evidential
there
one?
seems to be a logical inconsistency.
Okay,
So if
where's the
something's perfect,
contradiction?
it would be able to make perfection. If something perfect is making imperfection, then that
Same
seems,
question, man. Where's P and not P here?
So,
So why can't something perfect make something imperfect? What is the contradiction in that?
well, if you're talking about a perfect creator, it would be assumed that a perfect creator would only make perfect creations.
Why?
If it's analytically linked, if something is a perfect creator, logically he would not make anything worse.
But
I mean,
why
you're
though?
just kind of restating.
Yeah.
You're just kind of restating your argument. What are the theoretical contents? Like, what's the propositional content of a perfect being in an imperfect world, and where is P and not P?
Um, okay, you know what? Let's just
So
move on to the.
can I just ask this question as clarifying?
Yeah, sure.
If you had a perfect being that can only make perfect things, would you not say that perfect being is now limited because it cannot make imperfect things?
You could say so.
So then would that not take away from its perfection?
No, not necessarily.
How come?
Well, by nature of it being perfect, it would be limited to only perfection.
But it's limited.
Right.
So are perfect things limited?
Yeah, they can be.
And you don't see any contradiction there?
No.
Okay.
I don't see why that would be a contradiction.
Okay. Go ahead, Than.
But why don't, like, since you brought it up, why don't we talk about the probabilistic concerns? So again, probabilistically, if we have an all good, benevolent, all powerful being that's perfect in every way, would we see a world where there are millions of child predators? What do you
Yeah.
think the
So
probability? Like,
let's
it seems incredibly improbable.
yeah let's lay out the meta here a little bit though, um, because probabilities are going to be inherently relative, right? If you've worked in probability theory before, worked with like Bayesian statistics at all, right? You're going to have a square typically, and that square is going to represent 100% of the probability space. Different hypotheses are going to occupy different portions of the probability space based upon the evidence and our background knowledge. So, just putting things on the table here really quickly, without you putting up a competing hypothesis to theism, I don't really have to do much. Like I could theoretically even just concede that I take a probabilistic hit, but without you putting up a different hypothesis,
I
like
can
theism's going to
I
be the
can
most.
create many different hypotheses. They don't even necessarily have to be theist or secular. I
Yeah,
would
I don't care
say
what
the
you want to do. Yeah,
probability. Yeah, so I would say the probability of the god Crom existing. So Crom from Conan, he is a god that is loveless. He only cares about strength, and he has imbued humanity with the essence of strength to strive and slay their enemies, to fight whatever battles they need to fight, and he only cares about the strong surviving.
wow.
I think
Yeah,
that fits like that has a higher probability than this idea of there being an all-powerful, benevolent God.
okay.
Especially when we take a look at the theory of evolution, survival of the fittest. Those who are best adapted to survive, go on and survive. Humans, through both strength of mind and strength of body, are the dominant species on the planet. The reason we've got here at this point is because we fought, killed, we committed tribal genocide, we've fought the weak, and we won against the weak, and only the strong are here now. I think that fits. There's a higher probability of that theory
Yeah.
explaining
So
our world than
all you've done here
benevolent
is
deity.
front load your hypothesis to predict all the relevant data. In other words, though, what happens then when you do that is you're just transferring the improbability all to the prior probability, right? Because now you have a really really complex hypothesis, some kind of god with a bunch of arbitrary limits. You've tacked on a bunch of just a bunch of issues, right? So yeah, sure, it could theoretically predict all of the relevant data that you're asking for, but all you've really done is transfer the previous improbability from the posterior to the priors.
Well, the issue, like, there's issues with it. So we don't have any evidence for Crom, like,
Well,
no
hold on, no,
clear
no.
empirical evidence.
You would call this you would call suffering evidence for Crom, because the type of reality we live in is the type of reality you would expect if Crom existed, right? Like that's the whole point of coming up with this counter hypothesis. Presumably, you wouldn't spend all that time talking about your hypothesis if it didn't actually predict the data, right?
Well, we're talking about what's probabilistic given our observations.
And when we're talking about
Does
evidence,
Crom,
it's probabilistic.
yeah, so does Crom fit, like, does the Crom hypothesis have a higher probability than the all-powerful benevolent God hypothesis?
I I would say no, because again, like I said, you've front loaded your hypothesis to specifically predict for certain types of suffering and war and stuff like that. But I have no reason to expect tons of other things,
Why,
right?
so why does a benevolent God have a higher probability than a non-benevolent God who only cares about strength?
Well, like I said, you've just front loaded everything to your hypothesis and transferred the improbability to the priors. Again, because you don't have a simple hypothesis. Your hypothesis has a bunch of arbitrary limits. And
You're not answering my question. I
I
just
just
asked you
did.
simply
I just did.
why.
I have a simpler
You're not.
hypothesis. I have a simpler hypothesis, one that does not lack arbitrary limits. I'm just talking about the priors right now, right? And all I'm saying is, do you understand what I'm trying?
Are you
Do you understand what
are
I'm
you from?
saying?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you. Are you familiar with what he means when he says priors?
I'm not sure exactly what he means by
Oh,
that, but
yeah, no, that my bad. So when you're dealing with probability, we're dealing with prior probabilities. This is going to be the probability of a hypothesis given our background knowledge before we look at the data that we have in question, right? And if you heard of Bayes' theorem?
no.
Okay. Long story short, it's like a form of probabilistic inferencing that we can do. There's a few different formulations. The relevant one here is going to be called the odds form of Bayes, and the basic idea here is going to be you're going to have an equation, right? And the prior probability is we're going to have a likelihood ratio between the prior probabilities. So we're going to divide the prior probability of my hypothesis over your hypothesis and multiply that by the probability of the evidence given your hypothesis divided by the probability of my hypothesis divided by the probability of the evidence given your hypothesis. You get that number and it comes out. And depending on how it comes out, it either confirms my theory or yours. In that equation, all I'm saying is you are making it your hypothesis such that the probability of the evidence given your hypothesis presumably could predict it more than mine. But in doing so, you're hurting the prior probability by front loading your hypothesis to forcibly predict the data. And you're doing that by adding on ad hoc auxiliary assumptions on top of your theory.
Why would you assume I'm doing that?
Because you went on a 5-minute rant about the specifics of the properties of what was the name, Clog, and all these other
Crom.
things. And on top of that, he has arbitrary limits. It sounds like.
I don't know why you'd assume arbitrary limits.
Well, is he
I'm
all
just not
powerful?
Is he
assuming.
all powerful?
I have no idea. I don't have
Oh
knowledge
well,
of this god, so he may or may not be.
you're the one putting up the hypothesis.
So
Right, but the
I
point
think where he's getting
being,
lost, Stan, if I want to try to
Yeah.
clarify, so Than's trying to make an argument here is that what you'd expect to see from a godlike figure is all power, because if you don't have all power, you would have these ad hoc or arbitrary limits that you would have to explain.
I don't know why you'd have to assume a god is all powerful. If you read the Bible,
That's not where I'm
it
going with
acknowledges
it,
the
John.
existence of other gods.
Okay, my mistake.
I agree with
So
I agree with you, John, but that's not where I was going with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
yeah, I don't know why I'd have to assume that a god is all powerful. He may or may not be. I don't know how me as just a normal human being would know the limits or power of any particular god. So the only thing in this hypothesis that's assumed is the only quality that I know of Crom, and let's just say I grew up in a society that worshipped Crom and developed this mythos, is that the only thing we know about him is that the only thing he cares about above all else is strength. He hasn't told us about his specific properties.
Okay,
He
we
hasn't
can
told
stop
us
there.
that
We
he's
don't
all
know anything
powerful. The
about
only thing
Crom except for what one thing you said. What was that one thing?
he cares about strength above all else.
Okay, I'm gonna say that doesn't really predict much of anything.
Well, I think it
It
predicts
doesn't
a
predict
whole
for
lot.
consciousness, right? It doesn't predict for fine tuning.
Well, it
It
does.
doesn't predict for
It would predict for
it doesn't
consciousness.
predict for a material universe. It doesn't
I
predict.
just pause
It
you real
would
quick,
predict
Dan. I
for
just a
Yeah.
quick question. People are asking in TikTok who you are. Do you want me to go Than from Exploring Reality or
Me?
Than from Inspiring Philosophy?
Oh, you can point them to both. So for anybody, can I just say a quick
Yeah, go
like
ahead. Quick
yeah,
plug.
for anybody that doesn't know me, I'm Than. I originally started a channel called Exploring Reality. I've since moved on from that, and I'm actually joining up with Mike from Inspiring Philosophy full time moving forward. It's sub to both
And
channels.
Oh, I think I know him. I've debated him before. I actually like him. He's a pretty decent dude.
Mike, yeah, he's cool.
Richard, for all fairness, if you want to plug yourself too, you absolutely
Yeah, go
can.
ahead.
Yeah, so I'm Vegan Gains on YouTube. You can look me up. I'm actually streaming right now.
Nice.
Awesome.
Yeah, so a God that cares about strength above all else, it would predict for consciousness because intelligence, grit, moral character, though that is an aspect of strength. It would
Oh,
predict
okay,
for a
that's fine.
material
Yeah,
world
okay.
because the only way to project strength is one of the ways is through material means. So the ability to move force, lift heavy objects, destroy your enemies. So it would predict for a material world. It would predict a lot of things. So I'm just wondering why an all-powerful, benevolent God would have greater prediction about the reality we see versus a God like Crom.
Yeah, so you're just saying, so you're including consciousness because of like grit and stuff like that. Did you tell me why it would predict for like material universe or anything like that? Because like within the
Because
possibility space,
that's a way of projecting strength. So the ability to move a heavy
that's
object.
one way. That's one way of projecting strength, right?
Yeah,
Well, like within the possibility space, you could have immaterial beings that project that strength.
if they're immaterial, they wouldn't be able to move material. So they would
Or
only
if
be able
they're
to.
immaterial, they could still have strength in some capacities. Yeah.
Yeah, so strength of the mind. But in a material world, you could have both. You could both project strength through your mind. You could also project strength through physical action. So it would predict for both. So again, I'm just wondering why an all-powerful, all-good God would have greater predictive capacity for the world we see
Okay.
versus
Yeah, of
a
course.
God like Crom.
I'm just trying to unpack your hypothesis. That's all. Yeah. So
Sure.
I think on one end, I think a perfect being is going to be simpler than a being that is only that the only thing we know about him is that he cares about strength and that's it. And the
Just
reason why,
to clarify, what do you mean by simple?
yeah. So what I mean by simple here is in the philosophy of science, there's a bunch of debates on how to assess simplicity. Like I'm talking about the principle of parsimony here. I follow along the lines of like people like Richard Swinburne, where I think the simplicity of the hypothesis is going to be like a measure of a few different things. One being like, does this thing have arbitrary limits? So like for instance, um, when we measure the speed of light, for instance, when we're trying to think about the speed of light, for instance, we originally postulated um, I think we actually postulated an infinite number, and then we came across data that disconfirmed that number, and then we just kept on updating it as we got across different data. The reason why we postulated an infinite number is because we had no reason to postulate some sort of arbitrary limit on the speed of light. So all I mean by an arbitrary limit is like some sort of quantitative cutoff point in a property of
Is
something.
that I'm like fairly interested in science. I've never really heard of that idea that light was considered infinitely fast.
Yeah, I can find it for you really quick. I could be wrong as
Like
well. But like
like I'm sure throughout all human culture there's got to be somebody who thought that. But in terms of like the you know people who actually were thinking about this, who were scientists and interested in the topic, I'm pretty sure most of them thought that there was some sort of limit to the speed of light. They knew it was very, very fast,
no,
but I
it
don't
was
think any of them considered it was infinite.
um Danish astronomer Ole Romer was the first one to actually demonstrate light had a finite speed. Before that, it was postulated as infinite.
Do you like what do you mean by infinite? Instantaneous?
No quantitative limit.
Okay. Um
While you guys are looking that up,
what's
And so
yeah, I mean
the
it doesn't really
yeah,
it
it
doesn't
doesn't really
really
matter.
matter that
The whole
much,
point I'm trying
but
to make here is like this is just like a standard thing when we're doing hypothesis comparison, is we assess the simplicity of a hypothesis. And I'm just saying your hypothesis seems to have some arbitrary limits, and it's not really
Well,
well
it's
defined
not.
either. You have like the problem of well defined, like you have the problem that your hypothesis lacks a lot of theoretical virtues because it's not very well defined, and a lot of aspects of your hypothesis are inscrutable.
Well,
Like we don't really,
again, I'm not stating whether or not Crom is all powerful. He may very well be. Um,
yeah, it just sounds
I
like you're
don't
trying to
know
have your
how
cake
that
and eat it
adds
too with this,
to.
though.
I don't know how that adds to simplicity. By the way, like, is the theory of the speed of light any more or less simple, assuming it has no limit to its speed, or there's a finite speed? Because when you're doing complex math,
Arbitrary limits tack on a theoretical burden on your hypothesis, lowering its prior probability. That's all I'm saying. Does that make sense?
by virtue of there just being fewer possibilities.
No, it by virtue of it being an ad hoc addition to your hypothesis.
Right. Well, I never put a theoretical limit to Crom's strength or power.
Yeah,
So
but
we
you
could
did
just
put on
go with
but
he's all powerful.
you did put on an ad hoc thing that says he only cares about strength, right? So like
Okay.
like the measurement of the ad hoc
That
of
keeps
that.
things pretty simple.
But it's
Whereas
also
you
ad
have
hoc.
to
It's
look,
also ad hoc because all you're
that
doing,
thing
hold on,
again, it keeps things pretty simple though.
the measurement of how ad hoc a property is going to be is in
By the
direct relate.
way, you're also ad hoc assuming God is benevolent, all loving.
That's not ad hoc.
That's yeah. So if you'd let me finish, the measurement of how ad hoc something is going to be in proportion to how probable that extra hypothesis or statement is going to be on your base hypothesis. The base hypothesis is a god named Grom, and by God,
Crom,
Crom,
Crom.
a god named Crom, whose
You shall
properties we
not take
really don't
Crom's
know.
name
All
in
you're
vain.
saying is some mental state. And so by definition, we don't really have any base properties of your fundamental theory, which means that necessarily it's the case that the probability of just cares about strength being true on a condition Crom exists is near zero because we don't, or at least inscrutable, right? Like pick your poison. And so it's not a very simple
Wouldn't that
hypothesis.
be true of your theory? So he's all loving, all good. That would be true of your theory.
Yeah. So if you want to cash this out, like I think theism is actually a very simple hypothesis. My fundamental theory is going to be at like fundamental reality. We have um, a thing that is omnipotent. But I also think omnipotence entails omniscience because I think the power to think, for instance,
Yeah.
entails being a mind. Um, and then if you take into account like this thesis of motivational internalism, which is this idea that like if that your motivations are brought about by perceived value in things, and so long as you don't have like any sort of weakness, you'll pursue those things. Um, so like in the literature and psychology and philosophy, it's called akrasia, which is just weakness of the will and stuff like that. The basic idea is here, like this being obviously then wouldn't have a weakness of the will since it would be omnipotent, and it wouldn't have weakness of the mind since it's omniscient. Um, and then therefore those two together, given motivational internalism, would entail um, omnibenevolence. And so like my base theory is just omnipotence, but from there it
Why would that
entails these other
entail
things.
omnibenevolence rather than omni-malevolence?
Why would it entail omnibenevolence over
Malevolence.
malevolence? Yeah, yeah. Mainly just because I think of again that motivational internalist thesis that I'm talking about, um, and I also
But I mean, it could easily just I don't see any, like, there's two possibilities: omni-benevolence, omni-malevolence,
yeah. If you want to
or
reject motivational internalism,
I
I would
I
just
mean, it could, or it could be somewhere in between. I don't know why it would necessarily lead to omnibenevolence.
yeah because again of that motivational internalist thesis that is pretty unanimously accepted.
Well, you're gonna have to explain that because I don't understand why that necessarily leads
Yeah,
to
yeah.
omnibenevolence.
The simplest explanation possible. Agents perceive value, right, and they propagate towards taking actions for positive values. so long as they have the power to pursue those things and don't have weakness either in the mind or power or will or something like that.
Why would we assume that premise?
Does that fit with your experiential reality? Do you pursue things because
Well,
you find value in them?
well, I could find value in things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I would act in a benevolent manner.
Yeah, because you have other weaknesses of the mind and of the will and of power. An
No,
omnipotent
not
being is not going to have
necessarily.
that. You think you have no weaknesses?
Well, guess what?
What's your bench, bro? I'm
I'm not saying I don't have any weaknesses.
kidding.
I'm not saying I don't have any weaknesses. What I'm saying is, if a being has no weaknesses, that doesn't mean they're going to be all good. That could mean that they just don't have any innate preferences either way, and that could very easily be the case.
Well,
If they
so
have no weaknesses, then
if
they have
if
no
you don't,
reason to act upon evil or
Can,
good.
can you guys define, both of you, what your definition of good is and what your definition of evil is?
I think it's too basic to define. It's like saying define red.
So I'm a moral anti-realist. My definition of what is good would be what suits your preferences, and definition of bad
Well,
or evil would be
if you're doing it from
what
the
does not
internal,
suit your
if
preferences.
you're doing it from the internal critique, you're trying to find a contradiction in God and being all good, and being, having evil in the world. So what would your definition of good and evil be in
Well,
this internal critique?
that's kind of one of my issues with moral realists. They basically say there's some sort of stance independent evaluation you can make where good is what good is. It's sort of like something in space that you can find.
So
Um,
you don't think good or evil have any like ontological properties?
what do you mean by that?
Like it's not something that actually exists. It's just a conceptual idea.
Yeah, it's kind of like whether or not you like pineapple on pizza. Like,
Mhm.
is pineapple on pizza good or bad? It entirely depends on who's eating the pizza. You may have your own set of preferences. Good and bad are kind of like that. That's the that's the moral anti-realist perspective. The moral realist perspective would be there. Good is just what good
Mhm.
is. It's some sort of objective, stance independent property that is separate from anyone's preference, and it's something that just exists.
Okay.
So you could, like, just to analogize, it would be like a food taste preference
Yeah, yeah,
realist,
I
where
understand. So what would
yeah,
your
regardless
definition?
of what. Yeah, so it would be regardless of who says
Mhm.
pineapple on pizza tastes bad. No, it tastes
Yeah,
good. You're just
yeah, I
wrong.
completely
Yeah.
understand. So what would your definition from the internal critique of good be? So to find a contradiction, you have to be able to define what it is.
Good is just what good is. I don't know any other way to explain it. It's
Yeah,
kind of like,
I, I'm
yeah,
with
it's kind of like,
I'm with Richard here, John. Sorry to cut you off.
Mhm.
Wait,
yeah,
sorry
no,
to cut you off.
no, no, it's totally fine.
I'm kind of with him on this one. It's really hard to define some. Like I said, it's kind of like
Yeah, yeah,
it's like
and
hey
that's
John,
fine. I don't disagree with any of that. What I'm
oh,
saying is, for to be able to like get a logical contradiction of P and not P, you should be able to define what
Well,
P is.
well,
no, it's not the so that's not the issue. If we can both agree that there is something that we can agree on that's good, and something that we can agree on that's bad or evil, like, that's really all we have to do. And I think we do share fundamentally a lot of the same values. I think we both don't want to see people get killed. I think we both don't want to see children get hurt, stuff like that. So that if we can just agree on that, we don't really have to agree on a definition of good or bad.
yeah, 'cause,
Yeah. So
let me,
I would
John,
disagree, but
can
I don't want to press that. I want to do a couple super chats and I'll let you guys keep going after that. Skeptical Everything just came in, said that you were waiting. That's fine. Yeterson says, how can you even deduct what evil is without God? I think he's asking you if you want to
Yeah,
answer that.
can before Richard answers that, because I actually, John, you'll probably don't like me for this, but um, I I don't really like this line of reasoning that theists use in general. And I say that as a Christian. I think you can be an atheist and a moral realist, and I think that there's not an issue there.
I know you do.
Um, What?
I know we disagree on that.
Okay.
Yeah, I already knew that beforehand.
I just want to make sure people aren't going to project what I'm saying onto you. That's all. Because I
Yep.
know that some people get uppity about that. So
Richard, did you want to? You kind of already did answer that. Did you want to dive more into that?
Yeah, so what is evil without God? So you can believe in evil without being a moral realist, and you can certainly be a moral realist while being an atheist. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. Fundamentally, anything that you perceive as bad, like morally bad, it's just something that goes against your own, personal preferences. When we're talking about morals, we're really just talking about personal preferences. Do you have a preference to see people injured and hurt and suffering, or do you have a preference to see them thriving, happy, doing well? That's really what we're talking about when we're talking about good or bad, or good and evil. And I think there is a distinction between bad and evil. Like saying something mean to somebody might be perceived as bad, but completely destroying somebody's life, you could say, is an act of evil. So evil in an atheist worldview would just be something that's like grossly against your preferences.
Anonymous came in. Love your channel. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. This is not me. It's just him. This guy's boring. Just rep eating. Can we move? And then Jesus is Lord and King.
I can hop off, man. If people are getting bored of this, that's fine.
People are not getting bored of it.
Also, like I said, I was kind of grinding camos on Call of Duty, and then I was told to come up.
Well, no, you offered.
No, I know. And then you guys were yelling at me, and I was like, oh no. Anyway,
well, that's only because you offered.
Fair enough.
Yeah, but I think we can wrap up the discussion, and I really appreciate you guys having a respectful conversation. We were both able to talk without screaming, shouting, talking over.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that. That's hard to, find these days. I've tried having a debate about this with God Logic, and it just turned out being a complete crap show.
Really?
Yeah,
he's usually really calm.
That's surprising to me. I don't know.
It was a guy that he's partnered with his channel. It's not like the actual God Logic dude. Yeah, it was a lot of screaming and yelling.
Is that his name?
No, Black Doctor
might be. He had dreads. I think he had like big long dreads. Somebody. But yeah, I'd be totally fine to have maybe pick up this debate another time, and maybe just do some studying and reading, and maybe we can just continue the conversation. Before I go, I just have an interesting question to ask you. Let's say if God gave you all of his powers, but you had the same level of wisdom and everything you have now. Maybe you wouldn't have godlike wisdom, but you could snap your fingers, make anything happen. Would you intervene in all the acts of evil that are occurring on the world? So if you saw somebody getting killed, you wouldn't. You'd literally sit back and watch it all.
No, because the problem is having all that power without the foreknowledge or wisdom that also comes along with God could lead to foreknown consequences that I'm not aware of.
Okay. What about you? Yeah, I don't know what I'd do, man. I can't tell you what I would do in that situation, because I don't think we have really that deep of access to the deepest aspects of our psyche to know exactly what would happen, what would really happen, and what I would really be like in that situation. But
you just make your gains bigger.
Yeah, maybe I would just try to get stronger. I'm not as big as you. I
can help you with that, by the way.
What?
I can help you with that.
I've coached professional bodybuilders. I don't look like it. In the last 2 years, I went through 12 surgeries and lost a bunch of muscle.
That's messed up.
Yeah.
What's your best bench?
My best bench was 405.
Nice.
At 175, sitting around 14%, and I'm 5'7".
Yeah. Shit, you're strong. My
Not
best
anymore.
was 410.
Not anymore, man.
Yeah.
He got you by 5 pounds. You just had to one up you.
Yeah, I got you just by 5 pounds.
It's all good. Yeah, man. No, I'm not that strong anymore though. So.
All right. Well, thanks for the chat. I'll watch your video later, and I might get back to you and maybe inspiring philosophy and debate the topic.
Cool, man.
All right.
Thanks
Take care,
for your time, man. God bless. Congratulations, you made it to the end of the video. If you want to watch more, you can click one of these and you can keep watching.